Good morning, Liberty. It is Friday morning, February 15th, 2019. My name is Michael Bolden. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are broadcasting live, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here on the West Coast from the 10th Amendment Center in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles. So good morning to you. Good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be tuning in, whether it's live or in the archive. I am very grateful for you spending time with me. Actually, I'm very excited that you're willing to spend time with me talking about various issues. Now, today, I know everyone in the internet world, at least where I've looked so far this morning, is talking about emergency powers. I know I am a little bit too. I tweeted about it a little bit earlier saying, hey, basically the warning that I issued is, I think, the same type of warning that I learned from the founders. When you trust one person with a power, you have to think how it's going to be used in the future. So my thought immediately goes to, how is some future socialist nutjob president going to use emergency powers? Well, they'll probably say that the threat of climate change is a national emergency and use emergency powers to just take funding to do that. I think it is extremely dangerous. And I do want to point out that we're not going to cover what's happening today in any detail on this episode because just earlier in January, I did a show covering some thoughts primarily from my good friend Chris Ann Hall. And I've linked that in the show notes here on YouTube. Of course, we have all of our show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. So today I want to talk about a different national emergency, and I think this one is huge, because if it isn't addressed, it's going to address all of us. You can't argue with math, and things that can't go on forever don't. The national debt is now at $22 trillion, and it is picking up pace, in my opinion. It's really, really dangerous, and some leading founders, I'm going to talk about them briefly, like James Madison and George Washington, warned us about massive debts. I know there are people like Alexander Hamilton who absolutely love them. So all modern presidents, and I'm not going to focus on the current president or the previous one. I think this is a systemic problem in both political parties and everyone who occupies the White House. They are willing to spend. They talk trash about the opposing party, and each team sides with them over the other, and it just creates this exploding federal power where we have the largest government in the history of the world. Largest in the history of the world is extremely dangerous. Before getting to all that, though, I do want to say good morning, Liberty, to all my friends here in the live chat and YouTube. I absolutely love it when you guys stop by. This is so cool because I spend half my day watching other people's YouTube shows, not always on political discussion. I watch some crypto shows, Health Freedom. My friend Robert Scott Bell does a show every Monday through Friday during the week at, I think, 4 p.m. Pacific time. So, I watch a lot of stuff, and I really like seeing people going out in the live chat. So, hi to Ward Lawrence, Existence, Justin Bayola, Bob Brewer, Denver Libertarian, Logan, Larry Clark, and I think I got you guys all. Well, if I didn't mention you or I missed you, thank you still for being here. Of course, if you like the show and what we've been doing here, make sure to smash the like button. Keep commenting, share, whatever platform you're using. We do this live on YouTube, but also share the archives over at Facebook, Twitter, BitChute, BitTube, and then, of course, we do podcast editions at iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher. I just submitted to Pandora and TuneIn. We'll see how that goes. But let's get into it. So, of course, again, thank you. Thank you very much for being here with me today. So let's get into what's going on in this other national emergency. A report that we published this morning, the latest national debt numbers from Mike Meharry. Mike works for Peter Schiff. He does a lot of the writing and a weekly podcast at Schiff Gold. I remember years ago, he was like, oh, the whole Federal Reserve economic issue it kind of overwhelmed him. But he studied and learned it on his own over the years. Sometimes I pushed him to, because we do a lot of work to undermine the Federal Reserve. But he learned enough about economics, Austrian economics, and the market cycles and things like that, and inflation and all this stuff, how the manipulation of the economy, then now he's like the lead writer and reporter for Peter Schiff at Schiff Gold. So he's a great expert on this. So we're very grateful for the work that he does for us here on this issue here at the 10th Amendment Center, beyond all the other stuff that he's been writing too. So here's what Mike writes. The national debt has pushed above the $22 trillion mark and is up on $2.06 trillion since Donald Trump took office. These are the latest numbers. When President Trump took office in January 2017, the debt was at $19.95 trillion. So, man, over $2 trillion, $1 trillion per year, basically, is what we're looking at. And the pace of borrowing, Mike says, doesn't show any signs of slowing down. The CBO projects that the 2019 budget deficit, that's government spending over revenue, will come in at $897 billion. That's a 15.1% increase over the 2018 deficit. So if you think voting for Republicans is going to get you small government or going to the, I often hear, and I know Michael Malice says this pretty regularly, because he's pretty even-handed in a lot of the stuff. He's not a partisan. I think he's an anarchist, which, he's not in favor of any political party. But I've heard Malice oftentimes say things like, oh, well, progressives or liberals or Democrats are going to the cliff at 100 miles an hour and Republicans are going at the speed limit. But in the last 2 years, Republicans held the entire federal government and they're going faster. Like maybe Democrats would have ramped it up even more, but it's not like anything has been slowed down. It's still going incredibly fast. It's ramping up, a 15.1% increase this year over last year, and another $2 trillion. So it's nuts. They're all bad. They're all to blame. And I did a video on this recently, just a short one that we have here on YouTube, that basically says they're all to blame. You can't let anyone off the hook. A lot of people want to make excuses for the president, for Paul Ryan, or for one side or the other, like, oh, it's always somebody else's fault. Well, I'm on Team Constitution. So when you have numbers that are this astronomical, no one gets left off the hook, in my opinion. So Mike goes on with his report, and he says, as Peterson Foundation CEO Michael Peterson put it, the $22 trillion milestone is, quote, the latest sign that our fiscal situation is not only unsustainable, but accelerating. It's getting worse, and it's going faster. And this is to be expected. When you get to the point where you just cannot continue this, it just absolutely cannot continue. It's going to really ramp up before there's a collapse. I'm not saying when there's going to be a collapse, how it's going to be, but again, things that can't go on forever don't. And this type of inflationary process, this type of massive spending is not going to continue forever. Whether it's in our lifetime or the next, somehow this is going to end. It's going to pop. Larry Clark over in the chat says Republicans don't even read their small government platform. And I think there probably is a lot in the GOP platform that says this. Jazz Creed says they all address it, but it seems like it only goes up. And I think, I've been really harsh on a guy like Ted Cruz because during the Obama administration, Cruz was more than willing to shut the government down over funding of Obamacare. And he took a lot of garbage for that. Oh, you can't do it. Obama's not going to sign it. It doesn't matter. You can't win. So just go along. You're wasting time and energy. That mentality is absurd to me because if people only did the right thing because everyone else agreed with it or because it was going to be successful, then no one would do the right thing. And I think that's what we see happening in Washington, D.C. Maybe there are a few good people there. And I'm not saying Ted Cruz is one, but maybe there are a few good people there. But if no one is willing to stand up against the odds, I think Ron Paul is a great example. Here's a guy that you would also often see one no vote on like the most inane spending thing. And he would say, I'm voting no because the Constitution doesn't authorize this. I think there was like some medal given to the Dalai Lama at some point. This is a great example how everyone voted for. It was like 434 votes or whatever to 1. And Ron Paul is the one who said no. And he said, well, because the Constitution doesn't authorize it. Why are we, honoring some foreign, spending money on, I don't know if it was a parade or whatever it was. But I think it's that type of mentality that has to be taken to a much larger degree. You don't just... so Cruz was absolutely correct in trying to make a stand, in making a stand in his own way. Do as much as you can. Duty is ours, right? That's the phrase. Do what you're supposed to do. Don't wait for everyone else to come on board first. Lead. So Cruz was great on that, but then he was garbage because he was getting challenged by a leftist, and so he had no problem voting to fund all kinds of crap just a few years later. So they flip-flop. They certainly flip-flop. MI66GT says, how could we demand an audit of where our money goes? We really need one in California. Yeah, no kidding. And Logan says, is this part of the reason for the big push for gun control across all levels of the government? I'm not sure, but they certainly don't like the idea of people being able to defend themselves at all. So let's go a little bit further into this report here on the national debt. Mike says, just consider the increasing amount of money necessary just to make interest payments on all this debt. And mind you, I'm going to get into a couple of statements from founders Madison and Washington here in a bit. But if you think about this as being dangerous, like I do, then this really should strike home. According to the Peterson Foundation, he writes, the federal government already pays out $1 billion every single day just servicing the interest on the debt. $1 billion every day. And that phrase, things that can't go on forever, don't. I heard it first by a guy named Chalmers Johnson. He wrote a series of books on the sorrows of empire, blowback series, the effects of the U.S. military empire and the blowback that it would get. And he was very popular in the George Bush days. He passed away. He's a hard conservative, or he was before he passed. A CIA asset, so he was definitely an anti-communist. He wasn't like a leftist, but he got a lot of attention from them because, of course, he was speaking out against the Bush wars at the time. I'm certain he would have done the same in the Obama years. I'm not sure how long he lived through that, but if he was well, and then again today. But one thing, I went and saw him give a speech in Whittier here in Southern California. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. And he said, we're borrowing, I think he's the way he put it, we're borrowing $1 billion a day from China just to keep this whole thing going. There's no way this can happen. Things that can't go on forever don't. And usually, what he warned was, if you look through history, maybe once in a great while, you have more freedom coming out of a collapse, like the American Revolution. Not perfect freedom, but certainly more freedom than what was going on under the king. But most times through history, when you have a collapse and chaos, out of the ashes rises a Mao or a Hitler or a Stalin. And so it is extremely dangerous because if you push towards collapse, there's chaos. And then the strong man comes in to bring control and run things, to bring peace to people. So that's what happens more often than not in history. Chalmers Johnson was absolutely a genius on that. And I think the founders recognize this type of thing as well. So going on in Mike's report, it's going to fork out a staggering $7 trillion in interest payments over the next decade. $7 trillion in 10 years. Growing debt, he writes, coupled with soaring interest payments creates a vicious, upwardly spiraling cycle. As debt grows, it costs more money to service it. That requires more borrowing, which adds to the debt, which increases the interest payments. And on it goes. For any of you who, like I, at some point ever got out of control with credit card bills, I remember, it's like 19 years old, free money, and they love that. I had free money. And it just gets out of control. You think you can pay it off. You spend more than you can. Your debt is too high, and then the interest rate hits, and then maybe you get a couple of late payments, and then you get a penalty rate, and then it goes up and up and up. And pretty soon you're paying more for interest than what you do on the principal. That was a messy situation for me as a young adult, a stupid young adult. But mind you, people seem to have no problem with government doing this. We don't hear much talk about the national debt, the amount that they're spending. I hear very, very little about it. And to me, this is extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous for our liberty. And that's what Mike concludes basically with his article. Nevertheless, politicians in D.C. seem utterly unconcerned about this skyrocketing debt. And it's only getting worse. So looking over at the live chat, Ward Lawrence has a great idea. And thank you, Ward. This is something that we've seen proposed a few times over the years, but I don't think anyone has the backbone for it yet. He says the states need to quit sending funds to the central government and keep their funds in their own states and invest in their own economies. Bob Brewer asks, great idea. How do we do it? And at some point, I'll cover this in more detail. But basically, there was a proposal that was introduced and worked in the Georgia legislature and then introduced in a few other states in the late 2000s, like 2008, 9, 10. And then we saw kind of wane off. I know Matt Shea up in Washington State up till around 2010 or 11 introduced legislation. We also saw people like Mike Ritz in Oklahoma introduce similar bills. And I'm not sure if he's even in the state house anymore there in Oklahoma. But basically, the legislation was called the Federal Tax Escrow Account. And this would call upon the states to interpose against the IRS and then collect all federal income taxes from people. And then there would be a panel that would determine how much of the federal government's activity was within the bounds of the Constitution, and then they would divvy to the federal government the amount of money that the feds deserved, basically. Now, this is a really, really strong move, and I think, the thing that's going to have to be dealt with at some point is the IRS and the Federal Reserve, and I don't know if we're anywhere close to that. But that would be the structure to do that, and I know many people would argue about the constitutionality on that. I could easily argue against it as well, but I think you can also argue, well, don't extreme constitutional violations require extra constitutional actions? Now, James Madison, mind you, and many others, they knew the difference between unconstitutional and extra-constitutional. Unconstitutional is a violation. Extra-constitutional is when the people, whether through their own state or otherwise, take an action because they are the sovereign, take an action beyond the Constitution to protect their liberties in a time of extreme danger. Heather Rossi says, the only party the Constitution allows is a constitutional party, Liberty Wave coming. I hope so, but I'm not too sure, but that would be amazing. I know people are clamoring for it, at least in some areas, and certainly it's incumbent upon us in the case of a massive collapse or an economic crisis or of the ashes that lead to a Mao, for example, to try to set the foundation for a positive step forward. That's my belief. We have to set that foundation as much as possible now. Ward Lawrence, I agree, nullify the 16th Amendment and the Fed. A lot of work to do to make that happen. But back to this discussion about the national debt. I consider it a huge national emergency. Mind you, all the individual things that they're spending on that they shouldn't be are national emergencies as well. All the gun control. I commented on my Twitter account in response to myself. I don't normally do that, but they call it a thread if you don't use Twitter. So you can create a thread of thoughts because you have a limited amount of characters. So I wanted to expand on it. And my thought is, you notice how anytime the executive branch, a president uses an emergency declaration, they're always using it to expand power. They never say, oh, there's an emergency of too much power, too much debt, too much surveillance. They never actually limit it. I think a real emergency, in my opinion, is all the gun control that's been on the books since 1934, the National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act of 68, the Undetectable Firearms Act, the NICS system. All these things are at extreme danger to the right to keep and bear arms. And the right to keep and bear arms are essential to our life, liberty, and property, and our potential prosperity. The defense of the country, defense of your family, defense of your property, defense of yourself. These are all under threat, and they have been for a long time. We've been lucky that things have not gotten worse than they already are. And a real national emergency like that, in my opinion, calls for an executive order to tell the ATF to stop enforcing those acts because of a violation of the Constitution. If you're going to run risk of impeachment from one political party or the other, you might as well do it over shutting down gun control. I mean, that would be a heroic action. But I don't expect that from the current president or any in modern times. I don't see anyone willing to do something like that. What about the empire? You have the U.S. military, I think, is in over 700 locations around the world. I've seen as high as 1,000. To me, that's overstretching by a huge shot. What about all the mass surveillance, the national debt, et cetera, et cetera? There are many ways, all the different pieces that feed into this that are emergencies in and of itself that cause all this funding and debt. So back over to it, I want to talk a little bit about what George Washington had to say. And I covered his farewell address a little while ago, a few months back, talking about how Washington, he issued a lot of warnings, basically. But one of them that he had focused on, or that a lot of people don't focus on, that I like to, is he talked about turning a blind eye. Because if you turn a blind eye to what one person does today because you like its political goals or its outcome, it's short term, and you don't think about the long term, that is extremely dangerous. And Washington warned us about that, and so did many other founders. And that's why I say you have to think about how you're going to use emergency funding. How is someone in the future going to use it? But here's what Washington said in that same farewell address in September of 1796. And mind you, we know that the drafts of this were written by James Madison, so they worked very closely on this. He also talked about national debt. He says, quote, "As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit." You have good credit, then you have strength and security. Without it, you don't. That's pretty clear. He continues, "One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible. And $22 trillion, no matter who you like or dislike in Washington, D.C., is not using it, quote, as sparingly as possible. It's not even close. It's so remote from that. It's absurd. History is not going to look kindly on this at all. I don't already." He also says, quote, George Washington, "Avoid likewise the accumulation of debt." Avoid likewise the accumulation of debt. I could say that over and over and over. It cannot be repeated enough. He says, "Not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts." So Washington, avoid the accumulation of debt. No one is doing that today. No one is following George Washington's advice. Period. It's not even close. And next up on this list is James Madison. Now, Madison talked about this in a letter called Political Observations. He only briefly touched on debt, but it's a piece of a bigger puzzle because he saw this, quote, "Of all enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other." And he continues, this is in 1795, quote, "War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few." So if you want to dominate people, you want to have a centralized kingdom, a tyranny, you need three things, according to James Madison, or you're going to have them: armies, debts, and taxes. And there is no doubt in my mind that we have a trifecta today. We have the largest military budget in the world. The next 8 to 9 countries combined are equal to what the U.S. does. And in fact, the increase in just this last year, the 2019 NDAA, when they passed it last year, just the increase of the military spending from year to year was as much or more than what Russia spends in its entirety. So we hear over and over, Russia, Russia, Russia is a threat to us. But just the increase in U.S. military spending is more than what the Russian Federation, or whatever they call it, is spending per year. So we have a trifecta: massive armies, massive debts, and massive taxes. I mean, the Boston Tea Party, even though it wasn't, the real story of it isn't what, the popular short version of it today. But this was over a minute amount of taxation in compared to what we have today. You combine all the taxes, I think the total is somewhere between 40 and 60% at all the different levels. So we have huge amounts of taxes on everything, everything. Gas tax is massive. So we do have a trifecta. They're all very dangerous. We were warned about this, and this cannot have a good outcome. It will not have a good outcome. The solution is not to add to it, to make it worse. The solution is to reject, resist, and nullify it at every turn possible, in my opinion. So over in the chat, Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. I haven't seen you here in a while, Alan. Awesome. You should also check out Alan's show here on YouTube. He says, but if government doesn't spend money to study the reproductive behavior of quail while under the influence of cocaine, how will we ever know? I think that's got to be real because it sounds so absurd. I'm sure they do something like that. Evan Harriman says the articles didn't fail at all. The original Coal Convention was only to tinker with the articles, give the power to tariff, and it was fine. Political Prisoner 2 says Washington had in mind the use of honest money like gold and silver and discharge of debts with an honest transaction, unlike inflated fiat money of today. Absolutely. And I'm actually reading a book called The Old Revolutionaries right now, which touches on the history of some of the leaders of the pre-constitutional days. Samuel Adams, Charles Carroll, Thomas Young, and I forget the other one. Oh, Richard Henry Lee. Can't forget Richard Henry Lee. And there's a section in there talking about Charles Carroll and his work in Maryland against the Legal Tender Act. Now, today, when we work on legal tender acts, it is to make gold and silver legal tender as they should be. But he was talking about Legal Tender Act in Maryland was to require everyone to use paper money. And his quotes against this about how using paper money and forcing it on people is going to lead to economic ruin. And he and many others, Richard Henry Lee talked about this as well, was certainly a huge part of it. So that is absolutely correct. Oh, Evan says that was in response to Justin. Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to follow along as much as I can. So I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it insightful. To me, it's definitely aggravating. I'm definitely worked up about this whole thing, the national emergency thing, because I think there are many emergencies facing us today, and most all of them are not being addressed even close. The country's in big trouble, and I'm hoping that at least to the best of my ability, I can spread the word about how things are supposed to be. And then you participating here, hitting that like button, sharing here, I can get right into my promotional spiel here, hitting that like button, sharing, signing up to support our work at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I know I see a bunch of members that are out here in the chat. If you guys do all that, it helps me, Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, Dave Benner, everyone else who kind of makes this thing tick. It helps us all do the work and reach more people. So we're going to continue, no matter what the odds, we're going to continue doing what we believe is right, and that's standing up for the Constitution and liberty, no matter who's in charge. So again, I hope you found this interesting, insightful, educational, fun to watch and listen to. And I really appreciate you spending some time with me here. I hope you have a wonderful Friday, and we'll see you next week and every week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Have a great weekend, and thank you again for being with me today.